Husband said women shouldn't drive. Wife's 50-year revenge will shock you. One careless sentence spoken in anger destroyed a man's peace for 50 years, and the woman who heard it never drove again, even after his death. This isn't just about a marriage gone wrong. It's the ultimate masterclass in psychological warfare, where silence became the deadliest weapon, and taking someone at their word became the most devastating revenge imaginable. What happened next will change how you think about power, words, and the terrifying cost of underestimating someone who's been pushed too far. Stay with me, because this story proves that sometimes the quietest people deliver the loudest consequences. My grandfather told my grandmother she had no business driving, so she stopped driving for over 50 years, even after his death, turning one moment of anger into a lifetime sentence that would destroy his peace forever. This isn't just family drama, it's the ultimate revenge story where a few careless words created decades of brutal consequences, proving that hell hath no fury like a woman who takes you literally at your worst moment. Picture 1950s America, where gender roles were prison cells and my grandfather ruled his kingdom like an absolute monarch. He'd clawed his way up from teenage nobody to John Deere management, commanding respect and building his American dream through pure determination. His success demanded a perfect wife who could execute domestic perfection without question or complaint. My grandmother wasn't just a housewife, she was a domestic military commander operating under impossible standards. 4 kids had to be perfect, dinner precisely at 5:30 p.m., house spotless for surprise business guests, and her appearance flawless at all times. One mistake could shatter her husband's professional image and unleash his fury. The car was her supposed progressive privilege, but it was really just another chain. The vehicle existed solely to serve his convenience. Grocery runs, kid shuttling, household errands that kept him free to focus on his career. Her mobility was his comfort. Her independence was his illusion of generosity while maintaining complete control. This system worked with Swiss watch precision for years. Grandfather walked into domestic paradise every evening. Perfect dinner, organized home, invisible problems. Grandmother orchestrated this complex ballet seamlessly, taking pride in creating an environment where her husband never faced inconvenience or responsibility beyond his job. But every perfectly balanced system has a breaking point, and their traditional marriage was about to explode spectacularly. One single day of chaos would trigger the most devastating lesson in consequences imaginable, transforming a moment of anger into 50 years of brutal justice that would haunt him until his grave. The stage was set for the ultimate battle of wills between a man who thought his word was law and a woman who was about to teach him that some declarations become permanent prisons for the person who makes them. But the tragedy was about to begin with the kind of domestic disaster that would shatter my grandfather's perfectly controlled world forever. On what started as an ordinary weekday, he walked through his front door expecting the usual symphony of domestic perfection. Instead, he stepped into absolute chaos that would trigger the most spectacular marital meltdown in family history. The scene that greeted him was his worst nightmare made manifest. No dinner aromas filled the air, no perfectly set table awaited his arrival, and most shocking of all, his wife was nowhere to be found. The 4 teenage children wandered the house like lost souls, unfed and unsupervised. Their homework scattered across the kitchen table like evidence of complete household breakdown. Dirty dishes sat abandoned in the sink, a dozen small chores remained undone, and the sacred 5:30 dinner ritual had been completely obliterated. For a man whose entire identity revolved around coming home to domestic tranquility, this chaos felt like a personal attack on everything he had worked to build. His blood pressure skyrocketed as he surveyed the wreckage of his usually pristine domain. Each unwashed dish an incomplete task feeding his growing fury. This wasn't just inconvenience, this was the complete failure of the system that made his comfortable life possible. He had just enough time for his initial shock to ferment into full-blown rage when the sound of his wife's car pulling into the driveway sent his anger into overdrive. The sight of her casually returning home while his world lay in ruins was the final straw that broke his legendary self-control. Before she could even turn off the engine, he was storming toward her car, his face twisted with the kind of fury that comes from having your expectations completely demolished. The explosion began before she could set down her purse or remove her jacket. His voice thundered through the evening air as he unleashed a torrent of accusations and complaints that had been building since the moment he discovered her absence. "Where the hell have you been?" he roared, gesturing wildly at the house behind him. "The kids haven't been fed, nothing's been done, and my dinner isn't even started. I work my ass off all day to provide for this family, and I can't even come home to a hot meal?" His rant continued with military precision, cataloging every domestic failure he had discovered during his brief time alone with the chaos. The unwashed dishes became evidence of her negligence, the scattered homework proof of her abandonment of maternal duties, the missing dinner a symbol of her complete disregard for his needs and comfort. Each accusation built upon the last, creating a crescendo of indignation that left no room for explanation or defense. My grandmother stood there absorbing this verbal assault with the practiced patience of a woman who had learned to weather her husband's storms. She had a perfectly valid reason for her absence, a genuine emergency that had kept her away far longer than intended. But his rage had created an impenetrable wall that made communication impossible. She was a good wife, trained to let him vent his frustrations before attempting to restore peace. What she didn't realize was that his anger was about to take a catastrophic turn, targeting not just her actions, but the very foundation of her limited independence. The words he was about to speak would transform a temporary domestic crisis into a permanent restructuring of their entire marriage, creating consequences that would last until the day she died. Right at that moment, my grandfather made the catastrophic mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As his rage reached its boiling point, he did what angry people often do. He stopped attacking the real problem and started attacking the wrong target entirely. Instead of focusing on her absence or the chaos at home, his fury laser-focused on the one thing that had given her any measure of independence, her ability to drive. "You don't have any business out driving around anyway," he bellowed, his voice cracking with indignation. "You should be home where you belong. I should never have let you start driving in the first place." The words poured out of him like poison, each syllable dripping with the kind of misogynistic fury that the 1950s had normalized, but would soon make him pay dearly for expressing. Women shouldn't drive. That's the whole problem right there. The transformation in the air was immediate and terrifying. My grandmother, who had been standing there absorbing his verbal assault with practiced patience, suddenly went completely still. Her face shifted from apologetic submission to something far more dangerous. The calm, measured expression of a woman who had just been handed the perfect weapon to destroy her husband's comfortable life forever. "You don't want me to drive?" she asked, her voice so quiet and controlled that it should have been a warning siren to anyone with sense. The contrast between his explosive rage and her eerily calm response created a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. She reached into her purse with deliberate, almost ceremonial movements, retrieving her car keys with the precision of someone performing a ritual that would change everything. "Fine," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "Then I won't drive ever again." The simplicity of her declaration was terrifying in its completeness. No arguing, no negotiating, no dramatic theatrics, just a promise that carried the force of an unbreakable vow. She walked to the kitchen counter and placed those keys down with a soft metallic clink that sounded like the closing of a prison door. My grandfather stood there in stunned silence, his anger suddenly deflated by the unexpected turn his tirade had taken. He had expected tears, apologies, promises to do better, not this calm acceptance of his furious declaration. Something in her demeanor suggested that this wasn't a temporary tantrum or a manipulative gesture designed to make him feel guilty. This was a woman who had just made a decision that would reshape their entire existence. She moved through the house with eerie composure, putting away her jacket and purse as if nothing world-changing had just occurred. Then, with the same domestic efficiency that had defined their marriage for years, she began preparing his dinner. The normalcy of her actions created a surreal contrast to the magnitude of what had just transpired. She was fulfilling her wifely duties while simultaneously implementing a life sentence that would make those duties infinitely more complicated for both of them. As my grandfather watched her move around the kitchen, the first seeds of doubt began to take root in his mind. He had gotten exactly what he demanded, a wife who would never drive again. But something about her calm acceptance suggested that he had just made a deal with the devil without reading the fine print. The woman who had just placed those keys on the counter wasn't the same submissive housewife who had walked through the door moments earlier. She had been transformed by his careless words into something far more formidable. A wife who would hold him to every syllable of what he had just declared, no matter how much it would cost them both. No one expected that my grandmother would actually follow through on her quiet declaration, but the very next day brought the first brutal taste of what my grandfather's careless words would cost him. When the school called about a mandatory parent-teacher conference scheduled for Thursday afternoon, the reality of his new situation hit him like a freight train. For the first time in years, he would have to leave work in the middle of the day to handle what had always been his wife's responsibility. The initial inconvenience felt manageable, annoying, but certainly not catastrophic. My grandfather grumbled as he requested time off from his manager, explaining that his wife was temporarily unable to drive, without revealing the humiliating truth about why. But as the days turned into weeks, the true scope of his domestic disaster began to unfold with devastating clarity. His peaceful weekends, once sacred retreats from the demands of his job, transformed into an exhausting marathon of chauffeuring duties that left him more tired than a full week at the office. Saturday mornings that used to begin with coffee and the newspaper now started with grocery store trips where he navigated crowded aisles while wrestling with shopping lists written in his wife's handwriting. The simple task of buying food for a family of 6 became a complex logistical nightmare that ate up hours of his precious free time. The children's activities, previously handled seamlessly by their mother, now required his constant involvement. Soccer practice, piano lessons, doctor appointments, haircuts, shoe shopping. Every aspect of family life that had once operated invisibly in the background now demanded his personal attention and transportation services. His teenagers, accustomed to their mother's reliable taxi service, began treating him like their personal chauffeur, adding insult to injury as his role shifted from respected father to harried driver. Perhaps most galling of all were his wife's weekly beauty appointments, which had always been her private time away from the house. Now he found himself sitting in beauty salon waiting rooms every Saturday, surrounded by gossiping women while his wife got her hair done with the same leisurely pace she had always enjoyed. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now facilitating the very freedom he had tried to restrict. Sunday mornings delivered the cruelest blow to his former lifestyle. For years, he had luxuriated in sleeping late while his wife took the children to church, giving him precious hours of solitude to read the paper and enjoy his coffee in peace. Now he was jolted awake early every Sunday morning, forced to dress respectably and shepherd his entire family to church services, where he sat through sermons about patience and marriage while secretly calculating how many more Sundays he could endure this routine. The psychological toll was immense. Every inconvenience reminded him of the comfortable life he had destroyed with a few moments of uncontrolled anger. Every delayed dinner, pushed back because he had to drive someone somewhere, served as a painful reminder that his attempt to assert dominance had backfired spectacularly. His wife never complained, never pointed out the obvious irony, never asked for her keys back. She simply adjusted their entire household schedule around his new role as full-time driver. But the tragedy hadn't reached its peak yet. My grandfather's stubborn pride prevented him from admitting his mistake, while my grandmother's unwavering commitment to his declaration was about to turn temporary inconvenience into a permanent restructuring of their entire marriage. The battle of wills had only just begun, and neither of them realized how expensive this lesson in consequences was about to become. But the tragedy was about to escalate into an epic battle of wills that would make both of them prisoners to their own stubborn pride. As months dragged by without my grandmother showing any sign of weakening, my grandfather began to realize that he was locked in psychological warfare with a master strategist who had turned his moment of anger into a permanent life sentence for them both. My grandmother's genius wasn't in dramatic protests or emotional manipulation. It was in her terrifyingly calm adaptation to their new reality. Instead of complaining about being stranded at home, she simply rearranged the entire household schedule around his driving duties with military precision. Dinner was moved to whenever he returned from his latest chauffeuring mission. Appointments were clustered together to maximize his driving efficiency. Social visits were planned around his availability, turning him into the gatekeeper of the family's entire social calendar. The psychological torture was exquisite in its subtlety. Every delayed meal served as a reminder of his foolish declaration. Every weekend consumed by errands hammered home the comfortable life he had destroyed. Every missed relaxing Sunday morning represented another casualty of his inability to control his temper. She never said, "I told you so," never pointed out the obvious irony, never once suggested that perhaps his declaration had been hasty. Her silence was more devastating than any argument could have been. My grandfather's mounting desperation became increasingly obvious as the months wore on. His friends noticed his constant fatigue. His co-workers commented on his frequent afternoon absences. And his children began to see him as their personal taxi service rather than their authoritative father. The man who had once commanded respect through his professional success now found himself reduced to a harried chauffeur whose entire schedule revolved around other people's needs. The breaking point came when he finally understood the devastating truth. My grandmother was never going to blink first. Her commitment to his declaration wasn't a temporary rebellion designed to teach him a lesson. It was a permanent life choice that she would maintain regardless of the cost to both of them. She had found something more powerful than anger or resentment, the moral high ground of simply taking her husband at his word. His eventual surrender was as pathetic as it was inevitable. After months of exhaustion and mounting inconvenience, he finally swallowed his pride and attempted to negotiate his way out of the prison he had created. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "You should start driving again. I appreciate everything you did to make my life easier." The man who had once declared that women shouldn't drive was now literally begging his wife to get behind the wheel. He tried everything: apologies, explanations, guilt trips, even outright pleading. He promised to never question her driving again, swore he would support her independence, and all but got on his knees to convince her to take back those keys that still sat untouched on the kitchen counter like a monument to his stupidity. But my grandmother had discovered something more satisfying than forgiveness: the absolute power of holding someone to their most carelessly spoken words. "You said women shouldn't drive," she would reply calmly to each of his increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation. "I'm just respecting your wishes." The most terrifying part was her serene contentment with their new arrangement. She seemed genuinely happy to never drive again, as if his moment of anger had freed her from a responsibility she had never wanted in the first place. My grandfather was about to learn that some declarations become permanent curses for the person foolish enough to make them. Right at that moment, my grandfather realized he had created a monster of his own making, a woman whose commitment to his careless words would outlast his marriage, his career, and even his life itself. What he had intended as a momentary assertion of dominance had become a 50-year prison sentence with no possibility of parole, proving that some mistakes echo through decades while the person who made them slowly goes insane from the consequences. The devastating permanence of my grandmother's decision became crystal clear as major life changes came and went without budging her resolve. When the children graduated high school and moved out, eliminating the need for constant chauffeuring, she still refused to drive. When my grandfather retired and had unlimited time to serve as her personal taxi service, she maintained her position with unwavering determination. Even when age made driving increasingly difficult for him, forcing him to navigate with failing eyesight and slower reflexes, she sat serenely in the passenger seat, content to let him struggle with the very responsibility he had insisted was hers to abandon. The ultimate test of her commitment came in the 1980s when my grandfather died, leaving her completely dependent on others for transportation. Family members naturally assumed that his death would finally free her from the declaration that had defined their marriage for decades. Surely now, as a widow with no husband to appease, she would reclaim her independence and get back behind the wheel. They were devastatingly wrong. "My husband always said that women shouldn't drive," she would explain, with the same calm certainty she had maintained for over 30 years. Even in death, my grandfather's foolish words continued to control her actions, creating the most epic posthumous victory in the history of marital warfare. She had transformed his moment of anger into a permanent monument to the power of keeping your word, no matter how ridiculous the circumstances that created it. The family eventually pieced together the most delicious irony of all. My grandmother had probably never enjoyed driving in the first place. At barely 5 feet tall, she had always struggled with the massive cars of the 1940s and 1950s, feeling overwhelmed by vehicles that seemed designed for much larger people. My grandfather had initially pushed her to get her license and bought her the car, thinking he was being progressive, when in reality he may have been forcing her into something she secretly dreaded. His angry declaration hadn't just created consequences, it had given her the perfect excuse to escape a responsibility she had never wanted while maintaining the moral high ground forever. She had turned his weapon against her into her liberation from an unwanted burden, proving that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone at their word and never ever letting them forget what they said when they thought their anger gave them the right to control someone else's life. The lesson became family legend, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangerous power of speaking carelessly in anger. My grandfather had learned the hardest possible way that words have consequences, that declarations made in fury can become lifelong commitments, and that underestimating a determined woman is one of the most expensive mistakes a man can make. In the end, he got exactly what he demanded, a wife who never drove again, but the cost was 50 years of inconvenience, a lifetime of regret, and the knowledge that his moment of anger had created a prison for them both. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't getting even. It's simply taking someone at their word and never, ever letting them forget what they said when they thought their anger gave them the right to control someone else's life. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against someone's anger is simply taking them at their word and never letting them escape it. My grandmother taught our family that words spoken in fury can become lifelong prisons for those foolish enough to speak them. The most devastating revenge isn't screaming or fighting back. It's the terrifying silence of someone who heard exactly what you said, believed every word, and decided to give you precisely what you asked for, forever. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button to help others find it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. And subscribe to join our community of resilient souls who've learned that sometimes being underestimated is your greatest superpower. Together, we're writing new endings to old stories, and I can't wait to share the next chapter with you.